know Dr. Thomas. Everybody knows Dr. Thomas here that I can, yeah. So Dr. Thomas is, I've known him for many, many years, and primarily through the geothermal subject, yeah. And but he's also very, very much involved with water resource. Um, and the kind of stuff he's going to be talking about is going to be really interesting today, because he's going to be talking about the various different what they found, yeah, underground. And so I guess we can go ahead and start, Don, whenever you're ready.
Okay. Okay. Now I have done this before, but I not very often. What I can do is I'll share my screen, because what I did is I put together a PowerPoint and gonna talk a bit about sort of recent findings, and I guess depends a little bit on what I mean by recent, over the past couple of decades. That it kind of relates to a conversation that Richard and I have had about sort of worldview and understanding critical resources for our survival here on the islands. And actually, just by way of background, for those that don't know me very well, I actually started here at the university in 1972 as a graduate student, and was doing research on Kilauea volcano, and got involved in geothermal research back when the first geothermal well was drilled in 1975. And that was kind of the discovery well for Hawaii's geothermal resource. And I worked on that for many years, and then got involved in another project that was a basic research project that has turned out to be, in addition to energy, our next most critical resource for surviving here in Hawaii is water. And it really changed kind of the trajectory of my research career, and has given us some really important new insights into Hawaii's groundwater. And unfortunately, most people, to the extent, when I say, oh, I'm doing groundwater research, if not a literal yawn, I get a figurative yawn, that, well, I turn on the tap and water comes out. What more do I need to know? And, I have kind of a set of favorite rants, and one of them kind of revolves around the Hawaiian worldview of the old time Hawaiians. The old timers, and in a sense, it's almost trivial to say this, but the old timers paid very close attention to the natural environment. And it's trivial to say that because they had to. It was a matter of survival. And the Hawaiian people paid very close attention to the natural environment and really understood many details of the natural environment here in Hawaii much better than the, quote, more advanced Western society who came on sailing ships. I like to tell students the story that the prevailing wisdom for Hawaii's volcanoes was that the Big Island, because it was the biggest, was the oldest of Hawaii's volcanoes, and the other islands were younger because they hadn't grown as large. Of course, the Hawaiian view was exactly the opposite, that Pele first went to Kauai, to dig a home on Kauai, and then migrated down the island chain. And I don't think that that story of Pele's arrival to Hawaii was accidental. It was because the Hawaiian scholars of the time, the Hawaiian geologists of the time, recognized the landforms, the volcanic landforms. I did a sort of informal study of place names in Hawaii, where I went through Mary Pukui's dictionary of place names, looking for reference to Hawaiian volcanism. And it was very clear that Hawaiian scholars understood volcanic landforms, how they formed, how they evolved in time. And they paid very close attention to the natural environment, including not just the landforms, but water, the weather, essentially the entire environment that they interacted with. And, in a sense, what I would like to see is us return to sort of that same awareness of these critical resources, because we don't invest in understanding these resources to the extent that we need to. And I'd like to say that the findings that I'm going to talk about today were strictly the result of my intense and sophisticated scholarship. But the truth of the matter is that many of these findings started by accident and really told me how ignorant we are of these resources. And so let me get started, and hopefully I won't put you to sleep, but what I'll talk about is sort of the evolution of our understanding of our groundwater resources here in Hawaii. So let me see, okay. And let's see, I will go to, I'm going to try to go to, unfortunately, okay, so I'll go to presentation mode. So rethinking a critical resource. And in that respect, we're rethinking our groundwater resource and understanding how we can better manage that resource, because it is truly a key to our survival here in Hawaii. Without our groundwater resources, we would not be able to be here. So our prevailing wisdom is that our groundwater system is fairly simple. This is a cartoon that is used whenever we talk about ocean island hydrology. And let's see if, okay, so for an ocean island, we have rainfall that falls on the island. It sinks through the porous rock down to a water table that forms inside the island. And that water table is slightly elevated above sea level. And then we have fresh groundwater down below, because as we elevate the top of that groundwater table, we're able to force seawater downward and displace it downward because of the density difference. Now, this isn't really a pool, it's just rock that's saturated. This is the unsaturated zone. This is rock that's saturated with fresh water that extends down to some depth. And the ratio of the elevation of the water table above sea level to that's below sea level is about 40-1. So if we have 100 feet of water above sea level, we have 4,000 feet of fresh water below sea level. At least that's the way the formula works. But this is a very simple picture of how island hydrology works. And in a volcanic ocean island, we have a slightly different picture, because inside of a volcano, we have these very dense dike structures. And those dike structures form sort of the core of the volcano, and they're very impermeable to water. And so they allow accumulation of water to occur at significantly higher elevations above sea level. But away from those dikes, the water table is not very high. And the water, all of the water is assumed to pass through, this is the so-called basal lens, through the basal lens to discharge at the shoreline out into the ocean. And the models are based on work that was done in the 1930s. Actually, Harold Stearns and Gordon MacDonald were hydrologists. Harold Stearns was a private hydrologist. Gordon MacDonald actually started out with the USGS and came to work for the University of Hawaii. And I had the very good fortune to be in one of his classes. But Stearns and MacDonald literally wrote the book on Hawaii's hydrogeology. This is one of Stearns's old models. This is from the 1935 publication. And again, you can see that earlier model that I showed you, which is our modern view, doesn't look much different from this. This figure is intended to show a young island like the Big Island, where we've got the dike complex in the center and a thin freshwater lens, and all of the water from the dike complex migrates through the lens and out to the ocean. The older islands where the island has been eroded away, those dike systems may be exposed, and you have springs that are producing water for streams. But again, everything goes to the ocean fairly close to sea level, either by way of streams or underground as submarine groundwater discharge. And that concept is very important to our management of groundwater resources here in Hawaii, because as I showed, the state of Hawaii, Commission on Water Resources Management, says, okay, we are allowed to draw so many gallons per day of water out of this basal lens, and it's roughly 40% of the total volume of water that enters the island or enters a given aquifer. And the balance is allowed to discharge at the ocean. And the reason for that is that water helps sustain our nearshore fishery and ecosystem offshore. These waters carry nutrients that are essential for the survival of the fish and the coral. So, but our sustainable yield number assumes that all of the water that enters the island passes through this basal lens and discharges to the ocean. And for the Big Island has been broken up, been divided up in these various aquifer sectors. And you'll notice each one of them, this has got 60 million gallons per day, 150 million gallons per day, and Hualalai on Omea, 147 million gallons. This is the sustainable yield, which is about 40% of the total. So we get a lot of water coming into this island, but the assumption again is that all of it is passing through the basal lens and discharging out to the ocean. Well, I got to learn how to use this thing. Now, recent work that I've been involved in has validated some aspects of that model, but it's also shown that they were incomplete. First project that I got involved with was Hawaii Scientific Drilling Project, and we actually started that quite a few years ago, but we didn't actually get to do any real drilling until 1999. And the project drilled a borehole here in Hilo, actually right next to the airport, and purpose was intended to be entirely scientific. We wanted to look at the chemistry of the lavas that were produced by Mauna Kea over as much of its lifetime as we could access. And there's still some mysteries about the underlying volcanism and the processes, the planetary processes responsible for Hawaiian style volcanism. And this project was intended to try to answer some of those questions. And so we were going to drill into Mauna Kea down at sea level and go as far back into the history of the volcano as we could. We wanted to determine the accumulation and growth rate of a Hawaiian mantle plume or hotspot volcano. and we wanted to document the underlying structure of the island. But the groundwater was expected to be pretty boring. Actually, the reason I got drawn into the project wasn't because of the groundwater, it was because I knew what a drill rig looked like. And so I was kind of the mechanic on the project and was responsible for managing the drilling. But I was figuring that we were going to see sort of the typical picture. This was the typical picture we were working with at the time, where we would drill through this freshwater lens here in Hilo. And once we passed through that freshwater, we would see salt water. And then as we continued to drill, we were just going to be in salt water and weren't going to see much at all of interest in the groundwater that we found in the hole. Now, one unique aspect of the project that is different from most of the wells drilled in Hawaii, typical water well uses a bit much bigger than this, but a so-called rotary bit that grinds up the rock and just flushes it away. They're not interested in the rock, they're interested in the water that is present. We were actually interested in the rock. And so we used bits that look like this. They drill a circular hole and leave us with a sample of the rock so that we can do the chemical analyses and sort of look at the rock and understand sort of the history, of that lava flow. And in fact, we drilled this hole 11,540 feet. We had very nearly continuous recovery of core. I think we recovered about 11,200 feet of core. So this is the most detailed record we have of the internal structure of a Hawaiian volcano. And we collected that core. This is one of the drillers unloading the core into a core tray. And then we had a whole team of students and science guys working on that core to document it and understand it. Now, I'm showing this slide because most of us, when we think about the island of Hawaii, we only think about this green part. And in point of fact, there's a whole lot more of the island underwater than there is above water. And in fact, we drilled, as I said, 3,500 meters, 11,540 feet. And we figure that we actually got about halfway down to the old ocean floor. So we still, even with that 11,540 feet of drilling, we're still only just barely scratching the surface. But a few things that we knew about the groundwater when we started this project for Hawaii Island, very permeable recent lavas, rainfall percolates in, hits the basal lens, heads to the shoreline, discharges into the ocean. So the recharge is lost very quickly. Groundwater is going to be very young. Unlike Oahu, Hawaii Island is too young to have a cap rock, which is one of the major reasons Oahu has as large a groundwater resource as it does. But we won't find any artesian water. There was that cap rock actually allows artesian water to form on Oahu. So we knew all of these things as facts. And so as we were drilling, we drilled through, and I'm going to have to show you some pictures of rocks here. This is what Pahoehoe looks like when you collect it as a core, almost like a foam, lots and lots of pukas in the rock, the vesicles. This is what an A'a flow looks like. We've got this clinkery material on top and then more massive, denser material with fewer pukas in it in the interior of the lava flow. And we passed through both that freshwater layer that we were expecting and into saltwater saturated formations. But I should have mentioned in that earlier slide that we actually started the hole in Mauna Loa. But Mauna Loa is underlain by Mauna Kea, and as the hole approached the bottom of the Mauna Loa set of lavas, we started seeing ash and soil. This material here is much less permeable to water. This is another image of a A'a lava flow. but these ash layers are actually fairly impermeable. And this is a photo of the core this is the last Mauna Loa flow and the first Mauna Kea flow. And so we had this long section of ash there. And when we drilled through that layer, we actually encountered a second layer of fresh water. And it was around 400 meters depth, around 1,200 feet, 1,300 feet below sea level. That water wasn't supposed to be there. So that water is actually being confined or trapped under that soil and ash layer from the interior of Mauna Kea and being forced to flow down below those Mauna Loa lavas and to actually discharge over 1,000 feet below sea level offshore of Hilo. So this was the first time we had encountered this deep freshwater layer on the Big Island. The aquifer actually was also under very significant artesian pressure. And when we drilled through that zone, the well was spontaneously producing about 2,100 gallons a minute of fresh water. At the time, that was about as much fresh water as Hilo, the city of Hilo, was using. So that's, a fairly significant groundwater flow, artesian flow. So we pretty well blew away everything that we knew about the groundwater here in Hilo. Turned out that when we analyze the water, we can analyze the chemistry, but we can also analyze the isotopic composition. And for those not too familiar with isotopes, most elements have more than one isotope. And for water, we have hydrogen and deuterium, and oxygen 16 and oxygen 18. And those four isotopes make up the majority of the water that we have on planet Earth. There's also tritium, but it's not relevant to the current discussion. Anyway, it turns out that rainfall is kind of fingerprinted isotopically according to where it falls on the island. And we were able to use that isotopic fingerprint to tell us that the water that deep water we were sampling here in Hilo came from rainfall that fell on Mauna Kea at an elevation of about 2,000 meters, or nominally about 7,000 feet. And a lady from the USGS actually went to the trouble to put out a whole series of buckets to catch rainfall on Mauna Loa. And these blue dots are the isotopic composition of the rainfall that she captured. And she plotted them against the elevation. And so all I had to do was say, okay, this is the water from our Hawaii Scientific Drilling Project. It falls right here within this series of points, elevation of just over 2,000 meters. So she did the hard work. I was just able to take advantage of that. We also analyzed the carbon-14 content of that water, and it turned out to be about 2,000 years old. So that kind of blows away the idea that, well, the water, as soon as it comes into the island, it discharges. It actually moves through the island at a relatively slow rate when it enters the island at that elevation. And based on the thickness, age, and distance traveled, again, we were about 30 kilometers away from the 7,000 foot elevation on Mauna Kea. We estimate that the water that we were seeing flowing through the system amounts to about 200 million gallons a day. That's a significant fraction of the recharge coming into the island on Mauna Kea, on the east side of Mauna Kea, or the southeast side of Mauna Kea, which is where this rainfall came from. And so we put together this model, a cartoon really, of what we found. And that was this: we drilled through this basal lens of fresh water from Mauna Loa into salt water. And then at that transition from Mauna Loa to Mauna Kea, we have this completely separate aquifer, this discharging water well below sea level. So we continued drilling, and we encountered new types of rocks. And this material here is kind of mushy. It was saturated with seawater, and it's a material that's generated where, say, at the time, Mauna Kea was sending lava flows into the ocean. This is fragmental material. But the interesting thing was that as we got deeper into that material, we found that it got cemented together. And actually, no water is allowed to flow through this material. We found no evidence of water flow. But we got down even deeper and we encountered this type of rock, which is called pillow lavas. And these lavas are formed when actually an underwater flow is generated, usually when you have an underwater eruption initiating that flow. The flow will hold together and flow down the flanks of the volcano. And these pillow lavas were highly fractured. You can see these fractures here. They were partly infilled, but kind of the surprise was that we ran through several layers of these pillow lavas as we drilled. They were saturated with water, and that water was under pressure. This is a photo taken on the rig floor. This is the drill pipe that we're using, and they have just sort of disconnected the drill pipe from the drill head. They're getting ready to put another piece of drill string on to continue drilling the hole downward. And, the pressure here may be, 50, 60 PSI. As we got deeper, the pressures increased. And at one point, we actually measured the pressure as high as 150 PSI in those formations. But the really big surprise was that this water was fresh. It was dominated in these pillow lavas. The dominant water that we got out was fresh water. We did go through some zones where it was actually hypersaline, but we saw no seawater at all. And essentially, these appear to be dead-end systems. And with those pressures, they're telling us that there must be fresh water much higher inside of Mauna Kea in order to displace seawater down to these depths than the conventional model was telling us was there. And we had fresh water extending to depths of 10,000 feet below sea level. So, it was telling us that, really there's a lot more going on here than we realized. This is kind of the old model from Stearns and McDonald, and they estimate that we should have fresh water only rising to a few tens or a few hundred feet, even under the Hualalai saddle in the center of the island. So we wanted to test, we didn't have money to do any drilling at the time to actually prove that hypothesis. So we used our next best method, which is geophysics. And there's a technique where we can set up stations across the island, and we can look down in an electrical sense and measure the resistivity of the rock. And what we are doing is using a very simple principle that wet rock is more conductive or less resistive than dry rock. And when we did that, this is a cross section along that line that we ran. And the color coding in here is according to the resistivity. And in fact, we did see dry rock here. This is just before the crest of the saddle. Resistivities were around 20,000 ohm meters. And we knew that was dry rock. We did when we started the survey, we started out here at about 2,000 foot elevation on Mauna Kea, where we have an existing well. It's a Saddle Road well. And we know where the water table is. And Mauna Kea rock saturated with fresh water has a resistivity between 600 and 1,000 ohm meters. So all we really had to do was look along this profile for that resistivity. And basically it's telling us that we had freshwater saturated rocks here as high as about 1,200 meters above sea level. And here, 1,500 meters above sea level or higher. And so that gave us enough evidence to actually go and drill a well at Pohakaloa. That turns out that the highest elevation of that apparent fresh water was beneath Pohakaloa. And so we drilled a test well there. The shallow water interval was dry. And actually, I should say that I think all of the hydrologists in the state were expecting me to be on a fool's errand because, everybody knew that, again, fresh water, we'd have to drill at least 5,000 feet, except that we hit fresh water at 700 feet below the surface. It turned out that was a perched aquifer extended down to 1,200 feet, but then we were back into dry rock until, I'll just move on, until we got down to 1,800 feet where we hit saturated zone and the hole remained saturated. Essentially, we were in a saturated formation from there down to 5,700 feet. And we believe that that is sort of the regional aquifer inside of Mauna Kea. And so what that would correspond to, that perched aquifer was probably this very shallow, low resistivity area. And then the regional aquifer, again, is consistent with this resistivity. So we have a very large freshwater, and if we take that earlier formula that I mentioned in that initial image, if salt water is depressed at a rate of 40 feet below sea level for every foot above sea level, then the elevation of this water would actually displace salt water all the way down to the old ocean floor. So what this was telling us is that we have really a huge volume of fresh water stored within Mauna Kea. And we believe that, at least this area we've demonstrated. Now, we've also done some surveys over here where we find similar evidence of high elevation fresh water within this flank of Mauna Kea as well, but we have not yet had an opportunity to attempt any drilling over there. So what we found when we did the analysis, this water comes from an average elevation of about 9,000 feet, 10,000 feet, about 3,000 meters. The age of the water is about, excuse me, about 5,000 years. So essentially this water is accumulating slowly, but it is a substantial resource. And based on the nature of the core, we think that there's there are dikes in here, so there may be some dike impoundment of this water resource. And this is a map of essentially the density of the island, and we do see this whole region within the saddle has a higher density than the flanks of Mauna Kea. And that has been attributed to the presence of those dikes. So we probably have a very large dike impounded system. The other interesting thing is that the temperature gradient in the holes also in this borehole suggested that we do have residual thermal activity. This is a temperature profile down the hole. This is the depth in meters. This is the temperature in degrees Celsius. And below depth in the hole of about 1,000 meters, we started seeing the temperature rise quite rapidly. And in fact, that's why we stopped drilling at the depth we did. We did not want to drill to a temperature of more than 100 degrees Celsius. But the equilibrium temperature, once we quit drilling, went up to about 140 degrees Celsius. So it turns out that we also accidentally discovered a geothermal resource, because we did not expect to see geothermal in none of my earlier work looking for geothermal resources on the island. Had we seen any compelling evidence there was a resource there. And that also accounts for this very low resistivity that we found down here. This resistivity is lower than fresh water, and it had to be either salt water or hot water. We know now that it is hot water. So we wanted to test the western extent of the groundwater inside of Mauna Kea. And so we ended up drilling a second borehole over here in what's referred to as the Keamuku area. And it was quite interesting because the results were, in a sense, well, they were surprising. They were different from what we found in the center at the first borehole. But it was telling us something very new and surprising about how Mauna Kea stores groundwater. Because we didn't just simply drill into a perched aquifer. We drilled into what we call a confined aquifer. That's an aquifer that has a impermeable formation below it and an impermeable formation above it. And for that reason, it's called a confined aquifer. And what we found was a whole sequence of confined aquifers that each one of them was pressurized. This is a figure that I use. Let's see. Do I need to move this? Okay. Is there a way to make that go away? Okay. Is this a message I'm seeing? Please move this window away from the shared application. Okay. Anyway, this figure is intended to depict the depth of the hole as we were drilling. The blue lines show the elevation of the water in the hole as we were drilling. And so we drilled down to a depth of about 1,050 feet, and the hole was dry. We had no water in the hole other than the water we were pumping in. But at 1,050 feet, we suddenly started to see water rise in the hole, and it rose to a depth of about 600 feet above bottom. So we had enough hydrostatic pressure in that confined aquifer to send water 600 feet up the hole towards us. But as we continued to drill, we drilled through the bottom confining layer and the water went away again. We got down to about 2,000 feet and we started seeing water, and through the rest of the hole, the water levels rose and fell. And at one point we encountered a layer that sent water about 3,500 feet up the hole. So this tells us that, that Mauna Kea is storing water in these confined layers and to very high elevations within the mountain. And the volume of water stored, I haven't even attempted to estimate what that volume is, but it's very, very large. And we saw that until we completed the hole. We didn't see the water drop out. This was a drilling break where we didn't take any measurements. But when we resumed drilling, we still saw water at very high elevation in the hole. So those confining layers, the layers that were trapping the water, were mostly ash and clay intervals, as well as explosion deposits. Okay, these are examples of these ash layers where the fresh water was being essentially trapped within these layers. Another example of ash that was very compacted and was essentially trapping water within the mountain. This is a huge explosion deposit. It extends from about here over to about here. If we look closely, I don't know if do I have that? Yeah. We can see these very angular fragments of rock. That was rock that had been broken up by an explosive event. And this apparently was quite a large event because this was the one that was trapping that 3,500 feet of pressure head beneath it. And so it must extend over a very large area of Mauna Kea. So let me move on. Essentially, these varying layers are the history of the eruptive activity of Mauna Kea, and possibly even have a record of eruptive activity of Hualalai and Mauna Loa within the sequence. But they have a very substantial effect on the storage of water inside of Mauna Kea. And it's my belief that we probably have similar processes going on in all the volcanoes in Hawaii. Okay, so I'm wondering, can you see this box that I'm seeing on my screen?
Yes.
Yeah, we can.
Okay, I don't know how to make it
now.
go away. Sorry about that. So anyway, a simple conceptual model of what we're looking at is that we've got these, normal lavas that are very permeable, but we also have these very impermeable layers buried within the sequence. And this is kind of a cartoon of the way these things may be present within the buried within the volcano. They may be dead end sort of pockets that just simply store water. They may be able to convey that water down to the nearshore basal lens, or they may actually go into the basal lens. But the bottom line is that this previous model that we've had is almost certainly wrong, and that there's much more water being stored within the island than we realized. And if we have these deep aquifers that are buried sort of within the volcano, they may completely bypass the basal groundwater system that we see in the nearshore environment and discharge into actually the saltwater system, the underlying saltwater system. And we do have evidence that this is happening. And they may completely bypass the basal system and discharge into the ocean well below sea level. And so the question is, do we have independent evidence that these things exist? And of course, the answer is yes. We see on the west side of Mauna Kea, water being discharged here in the vicinity of Keho Bay that is isotopically identical to rainfall from about 11,000 feet on Mauna Kea. It hasn't mixed with any other water in between. So that says that it's made this transit from high elevation recharge to the shoreline as a confined aquifer. We also have on the Keho aquifer, this is not Mauna Kea, but Hualalai, we have groundwater here, so-called high-level aquifer on Hualalai, that very clearly is made up of rainfall falling on the upper slopes of Mauna Loa. That water is migrating through Mauna Loa into Hualalai and actually is being trapped within Hualalai at high elevation. And it's very distinct from the water that's present in the nearshore basal groundwater lens. And I had conjectured, and this is a slide that predates some recent work that we just published, but I had conjectured that confining layer within Hualalai was causing the accumulation of fresh water up here, but it was also conveying it down below sea level and allowing it to discharge as submarine freshwater springs in the same way that the water that we saw in the Hawaii Scientific Drilling Project hole is being discharged offshore of Hilo. Well, it turns out that there's some wells, and that part of my reasoning was there's a well that Tom Nance drilled. It's a Kamakana well on the slope of Hualalai, and this is a plot of the salinity of the water that he saw in the well when the depth of the well was about 950 feet. Now, most drillers would have quit drilling, but Tom persevered and drilled the well down to 1,100 feet. And when he ran a salinity profile in the hole at 1,100 feet, what he found was, and I should say this, that to the right is higher salinity, and this is nearly seawater concentrations of salt. And this is freshwater. So Tom demonstrated that we had a multi-layer system there in the Keho aquifer as well, at a depth of about 1,050 feet below sea level. And that would be about 1,800 feet below ground surface. And based on that, we did, in a recent set of studies, we used a similar electrical technique to measure the electrical conductivity of the submerged flank of Hualalai along these lines. And the results we got were quite interesting. Okay, if I can get my pointer to work. Okay, this is ocean water. This is the submerged flank of Hualalai, and the resistivity is quite low, and it's consistent with seawater saturated rock. But as we go deeper, that resistivity increased to the point where it was consistent with freshwater saturated rock at a depth of about 300, 350 meters below the ocean surface. And so what that's telling us is that the line location is right about here. And so that's telling us that the offshore flank of Hualalai is saturated with fresh water. And so that let's see if I can move this thing. I'm not having any luck. Okay, anyway, that we have offshore here freshwater saturated formations that are discharging fresh water through submarine springs. Okay, what are we doing here? I seem to be frozen. I don't know, my screen is frozen. Can you folks hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Oh, okay, I don't know what's happening
Yeah.
here. But, let me see if I can escape the slideshow and then restart it. Okay. 1 second, just give me a second and I'll try to. There we go. So let me go down 1 slide. Sorry about that. Okay.
You're back.
Yep. Okay. So what's important about this? I don't know. Well, I don't know. I don't know why I'm freezing up here. Okay, maybe it's going to start up for me. So it's a good news, bad news story. The good news is that there's a lot more water stored inside the island than we thought. But bad news is that some of that water is bypassing the recognized aquifers. And that is essentially this water. We're not seeing neither of these sort of sources of recharge are we seeing in the nearshore basal aquifer. And the problem is that, going back to that sustainable yield, Commission on Water Resources Management assumes that, whatever recharge is occurring here, 40% of it can be withdrawn in these nearshore wells. When in fact, we've got some of that water discharging here out of their site. And so we can be in a situation where we are overdrawing on these resources and potentially in a situation where we could impact sort of the nearshore ecosystems. And there is evidence, in fact, that we have that all of the islands may have this same thing going on. And so that's is significant, not just to Hawaii Island, it's significant to all the islands. So why should we care? Again, we regulate water based on that simpler model of groundwater distribution. And sort of with an increasing population, a sustainable supply becomes even more critical. We got more opportunities for contamination and more and greater threats to the integrity of our groundwater system. So to return to the Hawaiian worldview, everything's connected to everything else. And if we can develop a better understanding of how water is stored and moves through the island, we can better manage the resource in a way that still meets the community needs while minimizing the impacts of its use. And sort of the examples that I would use, revolve around, PTA or Mauna Kea, the Keho Aquifer, and community cesspools. There's been a lot of talk about, contamination of the aquifer by PTA. And the water that I've analyzed up there, I see no evidence for that. But even if there were contaminants there, we're talking about several thousand years of water transport before that water would reach, if it ever reaches, the nearshore aquifers that are our primary source of drinking water. There's been great controversy over the cesspools on Mauna Kea. Anything that's put into the ground at the summit of Mauna Kea is not going to survive the trip. Now, one of the other projects I'm working on right now is actually the working with Department of Health on the Red Hill, the release of 49,000 gallons of JP8 from the Red Hill fuel tanks. Now, one of the things that I've learned and that I see in the work that we're doing over there is that the INA, if I can use that term, has many processes that allow it to restore itself. That contaminants may enter the watershed, but natural processes that occur within the aquifers, it's dominantly biological activity, but there's also chemical activity that will break down those contaminants. And we see in the Red Hill very active what's called biodegradation of the fuel that was released. And so if it takes 2,000 or 5,000 or 10,000 years for a contaminant or a drop of water that enters Mauna Kea near the summit to make it down to sea level, there will be no trace left of that contaminant at the end of that trip. And in truth, the much more significant threat to the groundwater resources are the community cesspools. Hawaii Island has some 50,000 cesspools. And, those are virtually on top of our groundwater supply in the nearshore environment. And, if we are going to expend time and effort and resources on protecting the groundwater, those need to go much closer to the top of our list than being pretty much ignored. Now with the Kehoe aquifer, sort of the case in point there, and there's a lot of controversy on using the high level aquifer, water from the high level aquifer over at Kehoe, with concern that withdrawal of water there will impact the anchialine ponds. I think that's very unlikely, because most of that flow from that high level aquifer is actually going far out to sea and discharging in the deep ocean. And in fact, if we are concerned with maintaining the anchialine ponds and maintaining the nearshore fishery at Kehoe, with this better understanding of the resource, I think, I would argue that we ought to be using that deeper aquifer and stop withdrawal of the shallow water from the basal groundwater system there in Kona, and allow the natural outflow of the basal water to be restored, because that's what's really needed to provide sort of that nearshore ecosystem with the nutrients that it needs. But the point here is that with investing in a better understanding of this particular resource, and not just here, in Mauna Kea, but for the whole island and for all of the islands, can allow us to make better choices and still serve the community needs, but through intelligent choices, minimize the impacts, the adverse impacts that we have on these resources, and be able to sustain them for the next 100 generations. So take home message: the simple models that we've been using can be useful in uncomplicated situations, but those models don't tell the whole story. And as population increases, the threat likewise increases for contamination and overuse of the resource if we don't understand it. A more detailed understanding will allow us to use the resource in a sustainable way. And with that, I'll call it done. I'll be happy to talk story. Any questions? And let's see, I will turn off my screen share so we can talk story.
Don, I got a question for you.
Sure.
So the Hawaii Groundwater and Geothermal Resource Center, is that the organization that would be analyzing and studying what you're talking about?
Yes, I mean, that's what we're trying to do sort of with that center, is to have it become kind of a umbrella to accumulate as much of the geothermal and groundwater data as we can, and work with the regulatory agencies, have that information available to them, but to try to serve sort of in an organizing way the research that needs to be done to get to that point where we do understand, we've got a better understanding of the resource, and can address the real threats to the groundwater, um, and understand the geothermal resource in the same way, so that we can, use these resources that are available to us in really the most sustainable way possible.
Don, I'd like to make one more comment. When I was up there visiting Nicole and the staff,
Mhm.
my first impression just looking around, it's a vastly underused, understaffed, and it really is amazing. What is more important than water and energy?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's to it, and I'm a geezer. I mean, when the hens come home to roost, I'm going to probably be, looking up at the sod. But future generations are going to be paying a price for our lack of understanding of these resources. And don't get me started. A lot of people complain about, oh, well, plantations were terrible, and yeah, they had too much control and yada, yada, yada. But by God, they knew where their bread was buttered. They accumulated huge amounts of data, and both climate data and groundwater data. They drilled holes. They wanted to understand the groundwater resource because their survival depended on it. And I do a lot of interaction with the Commission on Water Resources Management, and talking with Roy Hardy. He's the deputy there. Um, you know, I asked him, how many wells, would you like to have to be able to sort of monitor Hawaii's groundwater? He said, well, at least 300. How many do you have? Well, maybe 20.
How many do you have?
Yeah, 20. I mean, they're just nowhere near the number of wells, and there's nowhere near been the investment. I mean, in one sense, and I kind of had great reverence for Gordon MacDonald. I mean, he and Harold Stearns, they literally wrote the book on Hawaii's groundwater, and they got so much of it right that sort of we as the students have been kind of complacent and sort of assumed, well, that's all we need to know. And like I say, by accident, when we drilled this borehole there in Hilo, we discovered that, yeah, some real significant elements of that model are not right. And there's a lot more to do. And that's really kind of what my mission is for the rest of my time, working with the university, is to convey that message that we still have a huge amount to learn.
So
I guess,
Don, I'm sorry,
yeah.
this is David DeLuz.
Yeah.
Richard, kind of following up with your question. So, one of the things that when I was in the Energy Advisory Commission, Steve Bowles was served with me. And so he was because one of the things I asked Steve, so I asked Steve, where is all the data from the plantations in regards to water resource management? And he had indicated that they were working with some of the people of his generation that were kind of like the last ones that managed. Because one of the things that unfortunately they have decommissioned, and I'm aware of, at least on the Hamakua coast, on the Kamehameha lands, is all of the above ground reservoirs. And they were huge. I mean, some as much as 50 million gallons or more. And so, one of the challenges we have with water per se is storage.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have the capacity to store enough water in the event of a catastrophic event. But is there, is HIPA, the Hawaii Independent Planners Association, is there archival information that DOA got that? And the reason is in addition to that question, there are tremendous issues in easements to access those water resources that have to be addressed.
Yeah.
So, but anyway, I mean, you know this better than I, but I was hoping Steve, and then of course Steve got sick and he passed on, but
No. Well, this is a task that remains to be done, and I'll air a little dirty laundry. I mean, I had put together a proposal that went through the university. A major element of that was to try to compile as much of the groundwater data as we could lay hands on and put it into a database along with various applications that would, those applications would be driven by the user groups, by the Commission on Water Resources Management, by Department of Health, to be able to extract that information in an efficient way so that they would be able to make use of that as part of their regulatory efforts, but also the university would be able to access that data to do, these much more sophisticated machine learning type projects to allow us to go back and to look back and understand more about the groundwater resource. And everybody liked sort of the idea of doing a major water study, but digging up old data wasn't sexy enough, so they decided to do something else. I got another proposal in to NOAA, and NOAA there's a proposal in to set up a sort of a research institute on water, and it's climate and water. And so I've resurrected that proposal, and if it gets funded, then that's kind of what my focus is going to be, is to see if I can track down the old data. I'm afraid most of it has been lost, but or for all intents and purposes has been lost. I've pinged Department of Health. I mean, they get vast quantities of chemical data on groundwater. And when I've asked, can I look at some of it? Oh, well, no, that's in a container, out in the back of beyond. And so, for all intents and purposes, it's inaccessible. And I kind of got started on this whole concept several years ago. I had a bunch of money that was passed on to me to compile geothermal data. And I had way more than I needed to do that. I compiled all the geothermal data, and then I went down and talked to the seaworm guys. And when I was doing my early geothermal work, I went through all of their files, all their well records. And so to stretch a point, I approached Roy and said, hey, Roy, I've got this money. I've got a real nice high-speed scanner. How about I scan all your paper well files and turn them into digital PDF documents? And so I hired a bunch of students, and that's what we did. Now, there's still a lot more work to be done to be able to mine the data out of there, but at least we now have them in a digital format, and somebody isn't going to dump them in a dumpster somewhere. So, we have that data, but that's what we really need to do, is to go back and track down that data, put it into digital format, and then mine the numbers out of that into a database that we can, really use. Because, I in my pitch to NOAA, it's going to be a long time before we have another 100 years worth of data. The sugar planters already had that data in file drawers. And if we could resurrect that, we could do an awful lot of climate modeling with it.
So Don, there's one other thing that I don't think we're utilizing, and maybe you can help. So I sit on the Water Commission, and the last Farm Bill, there was a segment under USDA in NRCS that provided grants for watershed studies that could potentially, and maybe a conversation with DWS and you could kind of morph into a more expanded, so it maybe can be foundational and then expanded. But I don't believe anybody in the state has taken advantage of that opportunity. It wasn't a lot of money, but my understanding is there wasn't a lot of municipalities that applied either.
Really?
And I
Okay.
do believe the Biden administration will have more resources directly related to climate change, but you know, in regards to this matter.
Mhm.
But I'd be happy to see if we can create an invitation, and you know, you might be the person that could, because I know that unfortunately DWS does not have the personnel
Right, yeah,
or
this
the
is,
expertise.
yeah, this is a problem. And I, again, maybe a little laundry on the floor. That my institute, the Hawaii Institute of Geophysics and Planetology, and now Planetology, was actually established to serve as the de facto geological survey for Hawaii. And it's very frustrating. And when I was hired by the director at the time, I was told that, you know, like this is the rationale for this institute, was to focus on Hawaii problems related to geology, related to natural resources. And so that's kind of how I've pursued my career, and working in Hawaii on issues that were specific to, you know, security and sustainability in Hawaii. But as we've had new deans, that sort of mindset has sort of drifted away. And we don't even have really even a legitimate hydrologist within our institute or within the university. And to me, that's utterly insane.
Don,
Go ahead.
Dave and Don, going back to what you would that you were mentioning about the resources and the funding that may be coming from the Biden administration, does it make sense to wrap the data acquisition about water along with, because of the nature of potential geothermal resources in Hawaii, and that there's seems to be an overlap between those two arenas,
Yeah.
to frame it not only as a water issue but also an energy issue, because it seems that energy is the big deal right now with in terms of climate change.
Don.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
So Don, a lot of credible folks think we've hit the peak of oil already, you know, and we're just kicking the can forward by just giving debt.
Yeah.
So if we have come past the point, if we drop down the other side of the oil supply curve, the next question is, what is Hawaii going to do? And the next question after that is, how much data do we have on geothermal? Because we have a lot, we know that. How much, you know, I mean, you were saying that we don't even have 20 wells or whatever, yeah? How much geothermal information do you have?
Well, much less than that. In real terms, I mean, we have a very small section of the geothermal resource on the Kilauea East Rift Zone that is pretty well characterized, but you know, there's you know, that's probably amounts to 1% or maybe 2% of the geothermal resource that's available on Hawaii Island. We you know even less about the resource or potential resource on any of the other islands. The only other data you know that is even marginally informative of geothermal was the work that Nicole Outsey and I did on Lanai, because one of the issues that we have to face statewide is that we have a pretty high step to get geothermal power from the Big Island to Oahu. And it's a high step logistically, technically, and politically. we've got way more resource than we need on this island or could use. But we don't know whether there is, in fact, resource potential on Oahu or not. And part of our rationale for drilling a well on Lanai was that, well, you know, we're halfway to Oahu. We had an opportunity to extend a hole. We had, of course, inadequate financial resources to really do a deep geothermal well. But we had enough to get a temperature gradient and see if the gradient was at all encouraging. And actually it was. So we ended the hole at about 3,200 feet, which is, you're just starting to touch an area where there's resource potential at that depth. And we saw the temperature kick up. The temperature gradient through the bottom, few hundred feet of the hole was about 60 degrees, 60 degrees Celsius per kilometer. That's about 3 times the normal gradient. Of course, at PTA, you know, we're talking about something like enormous. It's 165 degrees C per kilometer. So it's not anywhere, you know, as hot as the potential that we see at PTA, but still warmer than we expected. And we're right now negotiating with the Marine Corps base Hawaii to see if it's possible that we could do a temperature gradient hole there on their property in Kaneohe, which is the Ko'olau caldera. But, you know, to answer your question more succinctly, we know virtually nothing about the resources on the other islands.
Yeah, I'd like to point out that Stevie Lee and Jasmine are from Congressman Kaheli's office. Yeah, so it's really good for them to hear this. Now, I wanted to point out, is there a geothermal heat, do you think, a resource on the Hawaiian Homes land on Mauna Kea?
The surveys that we did do indicate that there is some potential there. And that the surveys that we did were those electrical surveys, and we saw you know, fairly low resistivities that were consistent with elevated temperatures. Now, you know, the one of the things that you know, I always have to caution people on when we talk about this is, you know, we get pretty good estimates of what the electrical resistivity is, but the method doesn't tell us why that resistivity is low. And really the only way we can really define the potential there is to drill a hole. There aren't many other ways, but based on the results that we have so far, they're very encouraging that there is thermal activity there.
Yeah, and of course, the reason I ask is because if you can do it on Hawaiian Homes land, you can benefit the beneficiaries in many, many ways.
Oh.
And then it'll still benefit the rest of the people because they'll get cheaper electricity. And you cannot beat geothermal for, if you're dropping down on the oil supply curve, you just cannot beat geothermal. Everything else is intermittent and stuff like that, and it costs more.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
You
have a question?
Don, yeah, I have one, which is, do you have a current idea of what kind of financial resources it would take to do a proper assessment of geothermal resources on this island? I mean, at some point it needs to be done.
Yeah.
And the people that know how to do it sound like it's you. So is there a way to figure out what kind of financial resources would be needed?
Well, yes. I mean, it's a pretty good sized number, and ultimately, you know, I'll answer your question in kind of a roundabout way. one of the barriers, the tripwires on geothermal is that to determine the resource and characterize the resource, the way Hawaii's regulatory environment is, you will spend maybe 25% of your cost to find out whether there's a resource on permitting and getting through the permitting gauntlet. And it makes it extraordinarily difficult for, in addition to that very high cost, you also have, multiple years that you have to spend navigating the regulatory environment and the litigation environment before a bit hits the ground, where you know what you have. And whether you know, or before you know whether there's potential there, just because of the structure of the environmental permitting process. And so it then becomes a question of, okay, can we demonstrate that there's a resource there ahead of time? And what that requires is drilling some wells. And to drill a geothermal well in today's environment, that would provide the information necessary for an investor to, I think, to take that chance. I would say you need 2 wells for each location, and probably 8 to 10 million per well is what they're going to cost. So that's
Okay,
kind of.
so here's a question: would there be a regulatory difference if the stated purpose was to do water exploration versus geothermal? Because you theoretically, and please tell me if I'm wrong, if you would be able to get the data regardless of what your stated purpose was, and if the gauntlet of regulation was simpler for water than for stated geothermal, would that be a workaround, at least in the near term?
Well, yes. I mean, the short answer is yes. But in order to do that, though, and there's always a but, we would be limited on the depth and the temperature to which we could drill. Because as I mentioned, for the PTA hole, I made kind of the executive decision that I wasn't going to drill beyond 100 degrees Celsius. Because of course, engineering, the engineering division at DLNR requires a certain set of characteristics for a geothermal exploration well. You need heavy duty casing, you need long strings of casing, and that's all appropriate. But in a water well, you're not required to design them the same way. But and I can say from very unhappy experience, as soon as you put in a proposal for any geothermal exploration of any sort whatsoever, you will have a lawsuit. We were funded by the engineering division some years back to do some geophysical surveys. And these are non-invasive. They have less impact by far than a backyard garden. But they insisted that for us to do that, we had to get a geothermal exploration permit. And by the time, and they only gave us about $50,000, which would have been adequate if we had just gone out and done the surveys. But by the time we jumped through all the hoops required for that geothermal permit, we'd already spent about $45,000. And at the hearing where the permit was issued, Pele Defense Fund and associates wanted a contested case hearing. They were denied that contested case hearing, but they were informed by the deputy AG for DLNR that they were free to sue the university if they felt that their rights had not been properly respected, and they did.
Okay.
And at that point, we gave the permit back and walked away from it. So, you know, that's
there's a
environment.
lot of work to be, yeah, there's a lot of, so the major hurdle is social and community based, it's human based, and you know, so there's work. I mean, this is something that needs to be done, and clearly there's a lot of work that needs to be done on that level. You know, in terms of community understanding. Also, the regulatory environment needs to be modernized based on the need and the potential, and the, you know, where the pluses and the minuses can be balanced out. So yeah, there's a lot of work to do, and what you're saying is consistent with my understanding, which is that if we base going forward towards that goal on the existing, on the status quo, we'll never get there. I mean, this is one of many things that that needs to be updated. For instance, for education, infrastructure is looked at as being wood and cement and buildings, and infrastructure is totally different now. And you know, it's based on rules that were written in 1955 for you know, for capital improvements. Mm-hmm. So we're at a point now where the log curve for, you know, for technology and scientific understanding, you know, all this, but so stuff has to change. But what I'm looking for is that's all. Aside from that, as far as just simply doing the physical work, you know, nailing down some sort of a budget that it would take, what it would cost to do that, you know, and not budgeting for lawyers along the way.
No. Well,
can I say something, Stevie? We'd like to stay in touch with you, and thanks a lot for sitting here and listening to everything, because this is really important stuff. I know you know that, yeah. So.
Oh, I completely agree.
Yeah.
The Congressman and I, we've been working on wastewater, and we've been in several meetings, and it's not an exciting topic, but we didn't realize it had been neglected for 50 years. And now I feel the same about this groundwater and freshwater issue. And it's a great opportunity because we have Congressman Hualalai. He actually just got back into town today, and he's on the infrastructure committee, and there's a ton of money with Biden's infrastructure bill. So it's a great opportunity for Hawaii Island to like make steps in the right direction with, you know, fresh water and groundwater. So I'm really glad that you guys invited me. It's super educational, and looking forward to meeting you guys in person.
Yeah. And what I'll do is I'll reach out to you and give you supplementary information, and we can, and I'll be the, you know, contact in between you.
So it's really timely and fortunate that Stevie and Jasmine could join us.
Yeah.
Because absolutely, when we talk about research and funding, with all this infrastructure needs that we're going to have, and Kai being on the infrastructure committee, this is a perfect segue into getting some funding, hopefully. But I guess we need to just educate the congressman on how and where, how do we start? And I think that's where Stevie comes in. I think Jasmine said you're the specialist in the energy sector, so we appreciate you being on here.
So Jerry, you know, and Stevie, one of the concerns that Don brought up is the legacy information is quickly disappearing as far as accessibility, to be able to collate. And then, you know, like he said, digitizing is a big first step, but then developing the necessary tools to mine it, I mean, it is the next opportunity from that perspective. But you know, the because the university is a land grant, sea grant, and space grant university, is there capacity within the context of those three to tie this into a more comprehensive research and development institute as it relates to energy and water resource management? And Don, you probably have more capacity and understanding of how that could maybe meld, but I think you know where I'm getting at. And one of the challenges is you know, after you and Nicole, if you get disbanded or the funding gets to dry up, what's get lost is going to be horrendous, and to be able to restart that would be so monumental. But that's one of the things that unfortunately I see that we're in danger of being of losing. But again, conceptually, I think there's capacity in regards. I mean, of course, the sea, land, and space grant universities. I mean, the whole intent of is research and development at that level that promotes the opportunities to solve wastewater and potable water and all these other matters. The good news is because the Big Island has such drastically unique geographical and climatic zones, we could be a world model if this institute has that capacity to be integrated. And you know, I think one of the things that you folks realize, Stevie, is that culturally we have that capacity of getting the East, primarily South Korea, Vietnam, China, and Japan, to collectively work with us. And again, you know, perhaps this is where the East-West Cultural Center has that opportunity to mold the two. But I just believe that there is impact with 47 nations just completed the virtual summit, and 3 of the largest polluters were part of that summit. So I think there's traction there. I don't know how to put it all together. That's more of I think a policy and initiative that maybe the senator, the congressperson can get UH on board, and not fight who gets the money. And that's why this concept of the institute, you know, it's not about UH Hilo, it's not about UH Manoa, it's about the institute per se. Anyway, sorry, but my 2 cents.
Sounds good. Thanks. Anything else, everybody? Any other questions?
Oh, yeah. I wanted to ask Don about the mining of lithium. And I know you're smiling there.
Yeah. Well, it's, you know, it's kind of a difficult problem. You know, the good news is when we analyzed the geothermal fluids, we did see that they did have higher lithium concentrations than saltwater, but the concentrations were still, seawater, I should say, the concentrations still were quite low. And the challenge, I'm sure that there's lithium there, but it would take a pretty significant technological step to get to the point where you could extract that lithium on a industrial scale cost effectively. That news article that you sent me that link for, thank you. But you know, that Mojave Desert and the fluids there are very highly concentrated. Actually, they have a geothermal facility south of Mojave in the Salton Sea area, and the salinity of the water they produce is almost 10 times the salinity of seawater. And so those waters have much more highly concentrated lithium values than we saw in Hawaii.
Well, you know, the value of lithium is going up with all these lithium batteries that's being researched. So I just thought it would be a a benefit to PPG or PGV to
PGV, yeah.
look into that.
I checked with Mike Kalikini to see if he had any recent data on their fluids, and I'm not sure. Lithium is not one of those ions that they routinely analyze for. But as it happened, we did analyses from the HGPA well. And as I say, they were more concentrated than seawater, but they were not, maybe by 50%. And with the Mojave fluids, they were probably, about 5,000% higher concentration in lithium than what we see here.
So
Right,
Don,
thank
Jerry
you.
brings up, I'm sorry, Jerry brings up a good point though. But there is capacity with technology getting to the point where some of this extract could be used for flow battery research.
Mm.
And that's where I think we need to know how these things touch, because even with geothermal, if we find a minimal resource for geothermal that has capacity to be able to be utilized commercially, and you couple that with a flow battery firm storage, because the key to this is when how do we utilize the curtailed energy as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
To be able to produce a hybrid of energy resource. So, looking at some of this stuff that I saw that Jerry, these are the same things they look at in researching flow battery capacity. So Jerry, it's not out of the woods. It's just that, and there's not enough that's being done in the flow battery side yet, because the technology has not gotten to the point where it makes it, economically feasible. But maybe the combination with the research in regards to the outputs in as far as the geothermal side could lead to a secondary flow battery type of R&D.
So maybe Stevie, you want to make any comments?
Fernie.
Yeah, no, I'm just really glad you guys invited us, and it's great timing because the congressman and I have been talking about wastewater and infrastructure projects on Hawaii Island. So this is perfect timing and a great opportunity. So I'm really glad that you guys invited us.
Right. So we'll be having more, and every Friday, so we'll send you invitations to it. This is just our Pau Hana talk story sessions. And we have guest speakers. So maybe Kai can join us one day. I know he's going to be in town next week, Friday, right? I mean, he's already here, right?
Just landed today, and Jasmine can coordinate it. Maybe he could jump on for a little bit. I'm sure he'd love. I'll be in his ear and brief him on this issue from today's call.
So you can check our website too, Sustainable Energy Hawaii. And maybe we can introduce Mitch Ewan. Mitch, why don't you introduce yourselves to Stevie and Jasmine? You're on mute.
You're muted.
Mitch, you're muted.
Yeah, my mouse wasn't coordinating. Yeah, so Mitch Ewan, I'm the Hydrogen Systems Program Manager at the HNEI, Hawaii Natural Energy Institute. And I basically work on hydrogen projects. So the new hydrogen station at Nelha is my project, along with the 3 county buses, the hydrogen buses that will be arriving here soon on the Big Island. So that's what I do.
Hey, Mitch, don't be bashful. Share your newfound notoriety in your patent. I think that's really important.
Oh yeah, so we're just awarded a patent on, I'll characterize it as a face mask for fuel cells for, it's a smart system that monitors the contaminants in air that are used in a fuel cell. Right now, everybody focuses on the hydrogen part, which is easier to manage because it's stored on board. But when the vehicle is running through the neighborhood, it's sucking in whatever's in that air. And the problem is these fuel cells are still pretty expensive, and you suck in the wrong contaminants and basically you kill your fuel cell off. So it's a smart system. It's like a heads up display for the driver. You can tell how his filter is degrading over time. And also a secondary role I'm thinking about is, you can monitor it over the internet as well. So you can have like a central control room, and all your buses are going around through the various neighborhoods. You can measure, if you put additional sensors on, you could measure what's happening in the air in all the various communities as well. And so that's just another option for it. But yeah, so we've had, we started in 2012. We finally got it this summer. We spent about $1 million. We have 2 of the systems installed on 2 of the buses that will be coming to the county. And we've had a lot of industry interest. We're actually working with a global company right now who want to employ this in their systems. And just this week on the interagency working group, with the DOE hosts every month with all the federal agencies, it was highlighted to the agencies, not once, but twice. So on the same call. So that's what we're doing.
Yes, so Stevie, geothermal is the cheapest way to get to hydrogen. And we're going to be, as the whole world is going to move to hydrogen, given enough time, yeah. And especially if you put on top of that declining fossil fuel, we got to move faster than slower. So this geothermal thing is really, really important, because if we can start doing research of the resource, so that when people come in to bid, they actually have the data. What it does is it de-risks the operation and lowers the cost for the rubber slipper folks. That's kind of how that thing is, yeah.
So can I make one more plug? So we talked about how do we get the geothermal power from the Big Island to Oahu, which is where it's needed. So if you Google in your time H2 clipper, hydrogen clipper, I'm on working with a company we're building a 1,000-foot long airship that can fly at 200 miles an hour and can carry about 200 tons. So we can make it from the Big Island to Oahu in about an hour. And we can carry a load of 200 tons of liquid hydrogen on every trip. So round trip is about 3 or 4 hours. So this has been going on for 10 years, and we've made a lot of progress on the design and everything else like that. So the guy who developed it is a guy called Ronaldo Brudico, who is a real friend of Hawaii. He's lived on Hawaii for 30 years down on the Gold Coast, but he just recently moved back to the mainland. And he runs the World Business Academy as well, which is a think tank. So Google h2clipper.com, and it's
What kind of fuel do they use?
going to use hydrogen. We're going to use a 20 megawatt fuel cell power system on it.
Oh, terrific.
And, everybody says, well, what about the boil off? Well, we use the boil off to run the fuel cell. So and then we use hydrogen as a lifting gas as well. So it's meant to be a cargo aircraft, not using it for people or passengers. And so, for example, we could take fresh produce from the Big Island to LA in 24 hours. And it's vertical lift, so you don't have to have an airport. You just lift off and go, and you go door to door. You don't have to go through the port. You don't have to go through all the intermodal stuff. It's direct. So we can make it from LA to, it'll go about 77,000 miles. And so we can make it from LA to China or whatever, Japan, in about 35 hours. So that should appeal to your representative, the senator, because because he's a pilot in the Air National Guard as well as Hawaiian Airlines. So he'll like this.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I'm sure he'll be behind you guys 100%. And I got the chance to look you all up, and I'm so honored to be on this call. You guys have, gosh, 300 plus years of amazing experience between you all. So thanks for including us. It's an honor. And I'm sure we'll be an integral part of trying to improve the water system here.
So I just want to make one more thing, because things has an infrastructure. We have to build a hangar for this, okay? So it's 200 feet in diameter. The hangar is 275 feet high, and it's going to be a single span. That's going to be the world's largest free span structure in the world. So it's going to be big.
Why does it need a hangar?
Because A, you have to build it, and then B, to maintain it and keep it out of the weather when it's not flying. Mainly, we want to be able to have a hangar
Mitch,
for building.
don't,
We want to build hundreds.
we want to have I was gonna say, we want a fleet of these, so hangars for each one.
Yeah, we're going to call it a pipeline in the
Yeah.
sky. Sky pipeline. This is going to be lined up. So
Should be cheaper than underground cable. Underwater cable, I mean.
well, I ran the concept by General Osserman, who used to be the head of the Air National Guard, and as airspace management, we just fly around all the through the military airspace and stay away from the commercial airspace. But you're not landing at a commercial airport.
I can
So anyway,
see
Go to the
maps
website.
printed across the side of one.
yeah.
Amazon could use this.
Jerry?
Anybody else wanted to say something?
Amazon.
Amazon.
Bezos, yeah. We're going to reach out to him, because all
Yeah,
his
good.
aircraft are old. He's got these old 747s that are just like total gas bags that spew out all sorts of pollution. We can carry 3 times the payload, 3 or 4 times the payload of a 747. So, and we're about 3 to 4 times cheaper. So it's really a game changer technology. It's a disruptive technology. So anyway, that's my pitch. At some point, I'll get a slideshow and I'll present to the Sustainable Energy Hawaii group.
Gee, top sheep.
So Wally, you want to tell Stevie about your project, your course and all that? Since we have him on the line.
Yeah, Stevie, thanks, bro. But you tell my cousin, the senator is the cousin with us. I come from Minoli, Tilka, so yeah, we're all family. But we're doing the gorse project on Hawaiian homelands. We're going to start harvesting gorse shortly and produce animal feed. That's for the hog farmers, chicken and cattle. So we working this with HPU and Department of Agriculture, UH at Paneva. They have a feed mill that will be producing animal feed. So we just kickstarting that up now. We over a year behind schedule because of COVID. But the other parts of the gorse will be used to make biochar out of the Kaihai Millennium Carbon plant. So that's one of the things we want to use gorse for help soil amendments and working on filters for the wastewater, the cesspools. So I got to get together with you, Steve, talk about that. So it's all part of the biochar and ultra capacity carbon production down in Kaihai. So we have the answers, or some of the answers, for your wastewater problem with the cesspools. So that's the projects we're working on now, and now that COVID kind of lifting, we're having more opportunities to bring in the necessary equipment and start production already. So yeah, you let Senator know we gotta get together. Thank you.
Shoot.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks a lot, yeah, Don, for giving us that.
My pleasure. Happy to be able to share it.
Yeah, not
gonna have
everybody
one
understand that, but oh man.
One question for
Uh,
Don. I'm just trying to follow up on the core samples we
Yep.
took on 13 North. You still have all that core samples? Or they still with Tabor?
I think still with Tabor.
Oh, okay. Okay. I just was wondering.
Okay.
I thought you wanted them.
Yeah, well, I kind of lost track of that. Maybe we can talk.
Yeah,
I
we can circle back because
Okay.
it's good to keep that samples.
Yeah, for sure.
That's what I was wondering. I wanted to make sure that we have proper storage and
Yeah.
add it to your collection.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. But we can circle back on that. Thank
Okay.
you, Don.
Yeah, sure.
Always an honor to be with you, bro. You're an awesome man, Donald.
It's
So Don, over
pleasure to
20
be here.
years ago, we were on the plane together, or either that or one of your drillers mentioned about the test wells that you're doing in near the airport.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, all these years, I was wondering what had happened to that well and why aren't we utilizing drilling or pulling up some water?
Actually, there's an interesting story there. We have a proposal in to try to go back into that well. But it hasn't, the site has not been used since we were there. And it's kind of a long story. I don't know, maybe it could be subject of another discussion, but no, we have proposed to do some testing for deep carbon sequestration. There's a lot of research that's been done on carbon sequestration, essentially injecting carbon dioxide into saline formations, geologic formations on the mainland. But there's been new interest in carbon sequestration into basalts because the carbon dioxide, when it's injected into basalt, actually reacts with the basalt to form limestone.
Oh.
So in the saline formations on the mainland or in the continental environment, it still stays as a gas. It has the chance to escape. But if we're able to sequester carbon dioxide into basalt, it reacts and it's there forever. So that means that, once it's in there, after the reaction occurs, then it's there for geologic time. And
Don, so you're mentioning limestone?
yes,
Is it as simple as using heat and making it into glass? Can I do that?
well, no, it would be entirely natural process where you would inject carbon dioxide. It would dissolve into the water that's down there and react with the rock. And that the ultimate products of that reaction is limestone, is carbonate rock. And, that's a permanent sequestration. And so we're not proposing to do that. We're proposing, though, to go into the hole and essentially test the hydrogeology in the deep formations. In other words, how difficult is it to flow water into the formation, flow water out? What kind of reactions do we get with the water that's down there, with the formation that's there. And so we are, if we can get funding, we're going to try to actually do research in that borehole again, that, sort of investigate the feasibility of that type of carbon sequestration.
Well,
What kind of funding you're talking about?
We've applied to DOE. I think we put in a proposal for like $4 million, and we'd have to bring a rig in and go in and use some pretty heavy equipment, because we're talking about 10,000 feet down. One of the nice things is that at that depth and the temperature that we have, liquid carbon dioxide is about the same density as water. So there isn't a lot of impetus to move that back up into the surface environment. And so, all of these things are issues that we want to kind of investigate and see what the feasibility is.
And that's the kind of things that our congressman and his staff can help us with, right, Stevie and Desmond?
Yes, definitely.
All right.
I'm texting the congressman right now, but yes.
Terrific. This is the longest Pau Hana we've ever had. Usually it's 1 hour, but now it's 2 hours. So obviously you're a big hit, Don.
You know what?
Oh, again, I appreciate the opportunity to sort of share the stuff that I've been doing. And I mean, my goal is really to help, get this information out and sort of help make it useful to the community. So this is great.
That's terrific.
Again, I appreciate it.
I have what may be, what may be, hey, Don, this may be kind of a silly question or something, but the information that is, like you say, out in some container somewhere, is that under some government agency's control?
It would be under either DOH or there may be a state agency that's responsible for archiving documents, and I'm using archiving in a
the reason I'm asking is the reason that I'm asking is I'm wondering if it's something that would be subject to a FOIA request.
Well, it's not that the agency is unwilling to make the documents available, but it may be getting the documents will be the easy part, but then getting them into a format that we can use, and that's really what the funding is needed for, is to be able to convert that and then have the database infrastructure, that word again, to be able to host that information and the software to make it accessible and usable. It's the kind of thing that as an individual researcher, it would be a huge so-called overhead cost to go in and get that stuff for that single study. Whereas if we can do it once and maintain it as a database, it's available for all researchers. And that's really kind of the idea, is that we make that available and then it can be used for multiple purposes, serving the needs of DOH, serving the needs of seaworm, serving the needs of the research community in doing climate modeling and that kind of thing. I mean, that's kind of where I'd like to go with this.
Sure, the preservation of knowledge is a very, very important thing for us all to be doing and to consider, to see value in. So
definitely.
Boy, that was a good discussion. Well, so we'll let you folks know when the new subjects coming up. We're having different people, different ready. So we'll be in touch. So thanks a lot, everybody.
Yep. Again,
thank you very much.
Pleasure talking with you all. Take care.
Okay, thank you.
Aloha.
Thank you.
Okay.
Aloha.
Aloha.